Let's talk about exposure, how to get the correct amount of light for your image. And we measure light via a measurement called a stop. And we get our correct exposure via three main factors: the ISO, our shutter speed, and the lens aperture. Let's start with the ISO. If you've ever taken photos with stills camera and you choose the film appropriate to the environment, so if it's bright sunshine, you're looking at 100 ISO, more overcast, maybe 400, and it gets a bit darker, you're looking at some film which is 800, go indoors, 1600 or 3200. The higher you go, the more noise, the more grain you'll get in the film. The lower, the cleaner. But how does this actually compare to digital cameras? Well, every digital camera sensor has a base ISO as well. It's where it works at its best, but you can change it, you can increase it. And depending on the processing of that camera, depending on how much noise is added to the image. Some cameras work incredibly well. When you push up that ISO, you can't tell the difference, where others really suffer and you can't go much past that base ISO. This is where digital cameras have a huge advantage over film cameras. Film is at a set ISO, but with digital cameras, and if they are good at processing, you have multiple ISOs within one camera, which gives huge flexibility when shooting. Getting the correct exposure for our image is down to three main factors in the camera: the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture. Let's start with the ISO. We have it set to, say, 100. We set our shutter speed to what you need it to be, which is supposed to be, say, double your frame rate. So let's say it's at 50th a second. Then it comes down to our f-stop. Say we want to get a nice shallow depth of field and we set it to 1.4 and we go, wow, that's way too much light. I need to bring my exposure down. What can you do? Well, you can't lower your ISO. You can go higher, you can make it brighter, but you can't bring it lower than 100. You can increase your shutter speed, but that's going to give you some nasty artificial movement. And if you change your f-stop, you're going to lose that shallow depth of field. That's where ND comes in, neutral density filters, which you put on either on the front of your lens or over the sensor. NDs are basically sunglasses for the sensor. If you want to keep your aperture at the set amount for your depth of field and you don't want to screw around with your shutter speed, which I don't recommend, then you are going to need neutral density filters. Whether you have them on the front of the lens or on the camera depends on what you're using. This camera right now does have NDs inside, so it's between the sensor and the lens. We don't need an ND right now because we're indoors and we have it as clear, but we can have 2 stops of light reduction, 4 stops, and 6 stops. But it's a bit pointless right here because we need all the light we can get. Having 2, 4, and 6 stops of light reduction via the ND in this camera is very handy, although not that precise. You have a 2-stop gap between them. That's where something like a variable ND, an electronic one on the sensor that Sarah has, is really useful. She has fine control from 2 stops to 7 stops of light. So very fine increments, which means you can get that perfect exposure, have the shutter speed as you need it to be, and your depth of field with your aperture set exactly how you want it. It's a huge advantage. There are, of course, ND filters that go on the front of your lens. They come in 2 different types. We have the fixed NDs. These are set amounts which you put on there. These are great, but not very precise. So if your exposure changes, you have to change your filters. That's where variable NDs come in really handy. They're essentially 2 polarizers which work together to give you fine control of your exposure by turning the front of that filter.